Margaret had always been careful with money. After her husband Robert died 11 years earlier, she handled every bill, every payment, and every bank account herself. She kept a small notebook in the kitchen drawer where she wrote down every expense. Robert used to joke that the notebook was her command center. Their house in Dayton, Ohio had been fully paid off in Hangin-Ler-Mui-Chin after years of hard work and sacrifice. Margaret was proud of that house because it carried the memory of her whole life. It was where Vanessa grew up, where birthdays were celebrated, and where Robert spent his final days before cancer took him away. After retiring from teaching at 61, Margaret expected life to become quieter and more peaceful. Instead, she started noticing things she had ignored while working long hours at school. One afternoon, she opened a letter from a bank she did not recognize. At first, she thought it was junk mail or some kind of mistake, but when she looked closer, her stomach tightened. The letter was a statement for a home equity line of credit opened under her name. The balance was $42,000. Margaret froze at the kitchen table and read the page again and again. The address was correct. The account number was real. The loan was tied directly to her house. But she had never applied for such a loan and had never signed any papers. For a moment, she thought someone had stolen her identity. She felt cold and confused as questions filled her mind. How could this happen? Who had access to her information? Why would anyone use her home? Margaret immediately called the bank. Her hands shook while she explained that the account was fraudulent. The woman on the phone remained calm and professional. She said the fraud department would investigate and contact her within a few days. After hanging up, Margaret sat alone in silence. Outside her window, everything looked normal. Cars passed down the street. A dog barked in the neighbor's yard. The refrigerator hummed softly behind her, yet inside that quiet kitchen, her world had already begun to change. She stared at the statement lying on the table and realized something terrible had entered her life without warning. Someone had borrowed $42,000 against the home she and Robert spent decades building together, and whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. 3 days later, Margaret received a call from the bank's fraud department. The man on the phone introduced himself as Gerald. He asked several questions to confirm her identity and then explained that the bank had reviewed the account documents. Margaret listened carefully while sitting alone at her kitchen table. She still believed a stranger had stolen her information. Gerald then asked if she wanted to know the name listed on the loan application. Margaret said yes without hesitation. A few seconds later, everything changed. Gerald told her the co-applicant on the account was Derek, her son-in-law. Margaret went completely silent. The room suddenly felt cold and heavy. She stared out the kitchen window while trying to process what she had just heard. Derek was family. He had spent holidays in her home. He laughed with them at dinner. He called her every Sunday. Margaret could not understand how his name could be connected to fraud against her own house. Gerald continued explaining that Derek had handled all communication with the bank. The phone records, emails, and account details all pointed directly to him. Margaret thanked Gerald quietly and ended the call. Then she sat there for a long time without moving. The sounds around her felt distant. The refrigerator hummed softly. Cars passed outside. But inside her mind, something had cracked. She began replaying memories from the past year. Vanessa often mentioned Derek's work projects and business trips, but now those conversations felt strange. Margaret suddenly realized she knew very little about what was really happening in their lives. The next morning, she called Patricia, the lawyer who had once handled Robert's estate. Patricia listened carefully while Margaret explained the entire situation. When she finished, Patricia spoke firmly. She told Margaret not to contact Derek or Vanessa yet. She explained that this was not a misunderstanding. It was possible forgery and fraud. Patricia advised her to gather every document connected to the account before confronting anyone. Margaret agreed, though the truth already hurt more than she wanted to admit. For the first time, she understood that this problem was bigger than money. It was about trust, family, and betrayal inside her own home. Over the next several days, Margaret slowly began uncovering the truth about Derek's life. What shocked her most was not only the fraud itself, but how long the lies had been hiding in plain sight. Derek had lost his job more than a year earlier. Vanessa never told her. Every Sunday phone call had been filled with stories about business meetings, work trips, and new projects that did not actually exist. Margaret realized those conversations had all been carefully built to protect an image. While Derek acted confident in front of family and friends, he and Vanessa were quietly running out of money. Their savings had almost disappeared. Bills were piling up behind closed doors. Instead of asking for help honestly, Derek chose to create a false version of success. Margaret thought back to family dinners and holiday visits. Derek always arrived smiling and well-dressed. He remembered birthdays, brought gifts, and spoke with confidence about the future. Looking back now, Margaret saw something different beneath that charm. She began understanding how easily appearance can hide desperation. The hardest part was realizing Vanessa had also been keeping secrets. Margaret did not believe her daughter planned the fraud herself, but she knew Vanessa must have sensed something was wrong. Money had suddenly appeared while Derek had no real income. Yet Vanessa chose not to ask difficult questions because the answers would have forced her to face the truth. Margaret felt a deep sadness every time she thought about it. She had raised Vanessa to value honesty and responsibility. Now her daughter was living inside a marriage built on fear and silence. Margaret kept asking herself when everything had changed. At what point had Derek decided deception was easier than truth? At what point had Vanessa stopped trusting her own mother enough to ask for help? Those questions stayed with Margaret day and night. The more she learned, the more she understood that the forged loan was not a single bad decision. It was the result of many smaller lies growing larger over time. Born. Margaret did not confront Derek or Vanessa right away. After 31 years of teaching middle school students, she had learned the importance of patience and clear thinking. Instead of reacting with anger, she focused on gathering facts. Patricia helped her begin the legal process carefully and step by step. First, Margaret requested every document connected to the loan from the bank. Days later, a thick envelope arrived at her house. Inside were copies of the application forms, account records, transfer details, and the forged signature pretending to be hers. Margaret stared at the signature for a long time. It looked similar enough to fool a stranger, but she knew instantly it was fake. Seeing her name copied onto legal papers felt deeply personal, almost like someone had entered her home without permission. Patricia reviewed every page and explained the seriousness of the situation. Derek had not only borrowed money illegally, he had used forged documents to place a debt against Margaret's house. Patricia told her clearly that this was felony fraud. Margaret felt sick hearing those words connected to her own family. Still, Patricia remained calm and steady. She advised Margaret to keep detailed notes about every phone call and document. Margaret returned to the old notebook she had always used for bills and household records. Now the notebook became something different. It became a record of betrayal, evidence, and survival. Patricia also contacted the district attorney's office to prepare for possible criminal charges. Margaret struggled emotionally during those weeks. Vanessa continued calling twice a week as if nothing had happened. Margaret answered politely and talked about normal things like gardening, the weather, and her book club. But every conversation felt strange now because she carried a secret Vanessa did not know she had discovered. Some nights Margaret barely slept. She would sit alone at the kitchen table thinking about Robert and the years they spent building a secure life together. Then she would open the notebook and reread the words Patricia once told her, "You did not cause this. You are not obligated to protect anyone from the consequences of their choices." Those sentences slowly gave her strength. Margaret knew the truth would eventually come out. She just wanted to be fully prepared when that moment arrived. 6 weeks after discovering the loan, Margaret finally asked Vanessa and Derek to come to the house on a Saturday afternoon. She told them she needed to discuss something important. Vanessa sounded slightly worried on the phone, but Derek seemed completely relaxed when they arrived. He carried a bag of food from Margaret's favorite Italian restaurant and smiled as he walked through the front door. That smile immediately told Margaret one thing. He did not know she had discovered the truth. Margaret invited them into the kitchen and poured glasses of water for everyone. Then she placed Patricia's folder in the center of the table. The room suddenly felt heavy with silence. Derek looked at the folder and casually asked what it was. Margaret looked directly at him before speaking. She explained that she had received a statement for a $42,000 home equity loan attached to her house. Then she calmly added that she had never opened the account or signed the papers. Derek's expression changed slowly. The confidence disappeared from his face little by little. Vanessa immediately looked nervous. Margaret continued speaking clearly and carefully. She explained the calls with the bank, the fraud investigation, the forged signature, and the records connecting Derek to every part of the loan. She spoke the same way she had taught students for decades, calm, organized, and impossible to misunderstand. Vanessa started crying before Margaret even finished. Tears rolled down her face while she kept glancing toward Derek, but he refused to look at her. He sat frozen with both hands flat against the table. When Margaret finally stopped speaking, the kitchen became completely silent. Then Derek quietly said, "I was going to pay it back." Those words hit Margaret harder than anger would have. He was not apologizing, he was defending himself. Margaret stared at him and realized he still did not fully understand the damage he had caused. Derek explained that he had lost his job and their finances had collapsed. He said they were desperate and drowning in debt. Margaret listened without interrupting. Then she answered with a calm voice that cut deeper than shouting ever could. She told him he could have asked for help honestly. Instead, he chose theft and deception. Derek replied that she would never have agreed to lend them the money. Margaret admitted he was right. She said she would have told him to find work and rebuild his life honestly rather than living behind lies. Then, Margaret turned toward Vanessa. Her voice softened slightly, but the pain inside it was clear. She asked her daughter to look her in the eye and tell her she knew nothing about the money. Vanessa could not do it. She lowered her head and stared at her hands in silence. In that moment, Margaret understood the truth. Vanessa might not have planned the fraud herself, but she had known enough to suspect something was wrong and chose not to face it. The realization broke Margaret's heart more than the stolen money ever could. A few minutes later, Derek stood up and announced that their lawyer would contact her attorney. Even then, he sounded more defensive than ashamed. Margaret simply replied that her lawyer was already involved. Derek walked out of the house first. Vanessa remained standing near the kitchen table for a few extra seconds. She looked at her mother with tears in her eyes and whispered, "Mom, I'm sorry." Margaret felt grief rise inside her like a wave. This was still her daughter, the child she had loved her entire life, but trust between them had shattered. Margaret quietly answered, "I know you are, but sorry does not rebuild a foundation." Then Vanessa turned and followed her husband out the door, leaving Margaret alone in the silent kitchen where everything had finally been spoken aloud. Derek never truly apologized for what he had done. Even during the confrontation at Margaret's kitchen table, his first response was not regret but justification. He kept saying that he planned to repay the money once things improved. To Derek, the problem seemed to be the risk of getting caught, not the betrayal itself. Margaret listened carefully while he explained how he had lost his job and fallen into debt. He described the pressure, the unpaid bills, and the fear of failure. But none of those explanations changed the truth. He had secretly used her name and borrowed against her home without permission. Margaret realized that Derek still saw himself as a desperate man making a temporary choice instead of someone who had broken trust inside his own family. That hurt more than anger would have. A real apology would have accepted responsibility without excuses. Instead, Derek tried to soften the crime by focusing on his intentions to fix it later. Margaret understood then that integrity is revealed most clearly in moments of pressure. Hard times do not create character. They expose it. Derek had chosen deception because he believed protecting his image mattered more than honesty. Even after the truth came out, he remained focused on defending himself rather than fully acknowledging the pain he caused. That realization stayed with Margaret long after he walked out of her house. After Derek left the house, Margaret could no longer avoid the truth about Vanessa. The silence on her daughter's face had already answered the question before any words were spoken. Vanessa had not created the fraud herself, but she had known enough to understand something was wrong. She knew Derek had lost his job. She knew their financial situation was falling apart. She also knew money had suddenly appeared without any clear explanation. Yet instead of asking difficult questions, she chose to look away. Margaret believed Vanessa convinced herself the problem was temporary, and that Derek would somehow fix everything before the truth came out. It was easier for her to stay silent than to face what might happen if she demanded honesty. That realization broke Margaret's heart more deeply than the stolen money ever could. She had always trusted her daughter completely. Now she understood that silence can also become a form of betrayal. Vanessa was trapped between loyalty to her husband and honesty with her mother. And instead of choosing clearly, she tried to protect both sides until everything collapsed. Margaret did not see evil in her daughter. She saw fear, denial, and emotional weakness. But she also understood that good intentions do not erase consequences. Families are not destroyed only by lies. Sometimes they are damaged just as deeply by the truths people are too afraid to face. A few weeks later, Vanessa called Margaret and asked her to reconsider the legal case against Derek. She explained that Derek's lawyer believed the charges could be reduced if Margaret agreed to stop cooperating with the district attorney's office. Vanessa spoke calmly and carefully, as if she had practiced every sentence before making the call. She promised Derek would repay the full $42,000 through a private agreement. Then she asked Margaret, as her mother, to protect their family from further damage. Margaret listened quietly until Vanessa finished speaking. Then she answered with the same calm honesty that had guided her through the entire situation. She told Vanessa that love did not mean protecting people from the consequences of their choices. What Derek had done was not simply a mistake or a bad financial decision. It was fraud, forgery, and betrayal. Margaret explained that if she ignored the truth now, she would only teach them that dishonesty becomes acceptable as long as someone feels desperate enough. Vanessa asked if principles mattered more than family. Margaret replied softly that her principles were the very thing teaching her family what real love and responsibility looked like. The conversation ended painfully, but Margaret did not change her mind. For the first time in her life, she understood that protecting peace by hiding the truth was not real peace at all. Real love required honesty, even when honesty carried consequences that hurt everyone involved. 3 months later, Derek officially pleaded guilty to felony forgery. The court sentenced him to 18 months of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service, and full repayment of the $42,000 through a structured payment plan. The illegal loan against Margaret's house was removed, and the bank closed the account permanently. Margaret attended the sentencing quietly without showing anger or satisfaction. As she sat in the courtroom listening to the judge speak, she thought about Robert and the many years they spent working to pay off their home. She remembered the sacrifices they made, the extra payments, and the evenings spent planning their future together at the kitchen table. That house represented security, honesty, and a lifetime of shared effort. Hearing the court officially recognize what Derek had done gave Margaret a strange mixture of grief and relief. She never wanted her family to reach this point, but she also knew she had made the right decision by refusing to hide the truth. After the hearing ended, Margaret returned home alone and made herself a quiet dinner. Later that evening, she opened the old notebook she had kept for decades and wrote down the final outcome of the case. Then, one more time, she wrote the words Patricia once told her, "You did not cause this." You are not obligated to protect anyone from the consequences of their choices. Those sentences had carried her through the darkest months of her life, and now they marked the end of a painful chapter she would never fully forget. Several months after the sentencing, Vanessa finally came back to Margaret's house alone. This time there were no prepared speeches, no lawyers, and no excuses. She sat quietly at the same kitchen table where the truth had first been revealed and began crying in a way Margaret had never seen before. The tears were no longer defensive or controlled. They came from real shame and real understanding. Vanessa admitted that she had known more than she wanted to admit before. She confessed that she kept avoiding the truth because she was afraid of losing both her marriage and her relationship with her mother. She explained that she and Derek had started therapy and that she no longer knew what their future together would look like. Margaret listened carefully without interrupting. The pain between them was still very real, but for the first time in many months, the conversation felt honest. Margaret told her daughter that forgiveness and trust were not the same thing. Love could remain even after trust had been broken, but rebuilding trust would take time, patience, and consistent honesty. Vanessa did not ask for immediate forgiveness. Instead, she simply thanked her mother for allowing her to come back and speak openly. Margaret made tea for both of them, and they sat together for hours talking about things they had avoided for years. Nothing was magically repaired that afternoon, but something important had finally begun. When Vanessa stood at the front door to leave, she hugged her mother tightly. Margaret held her for a few quiet seconds before letting go. After the door closed, Margaret stood alone in the house she and Robert had built together and felt a small sense of peace return. The betrayal had changed her family forever, but it had not destroyed her ability to face the truth with dignity. She understood now that real strength is not found in avoiding pain. It is found in standing still long enough to face it honestly and refusing to lose yourself in the process.